And it's also a very modern thing that we've seen in recent era of, if you do one thing wrong, or that is less than perfect, maybe it's not even wrong, but maybe it's not polite, for you to be completely banished, for you to be excoriated everywhere, no longer fired from your work, for you to no longer have a place in polite society. And if you apply that to the Crusades, that same, well, you have to be in all times perfect, well then yeah, the Crusades are going to fall short of that.
Welcome back, everybody. So glad that you're here with us on the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm Peter, and I have my brother right here with me.
I'm JP.
Welcome, welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about the Crusades, which is a very interesting topic to me, especially. But I think that it's an interesting topic for everyone, because who doesn't like knights in shining armor and conflicts and battles, and great battles in the Middle East. So we're going to be talking about the Crusades, what we know about them, and what we don't know about them. And so I'm super excited for this.
So Pete, I got a question for you. Why did you choose this topic? Like, why is this important in our day and age? Because, besides it being fun, which it is a lot of fun to talk about knights in shining armor, like you already said, there has to be some sort of deeper reason, I'm guessing.
Well, I think that whether we realize it or not, the Crusades they have a big impact on our lives, and actually a big impact on just our history in general. Because if you think about it, the Crusades, historians don't exactly agree on how many Crusades there were, but the Crusades lasted for hundreds of years, and that's hundreds of years of our history that we actually don't, like, most people don't really discuss and don't really know that much about. And it's not only hundreds of years of our history, but it's hundreds of very formative years of our history. This is when Western culture is actually, for the first time, really interacting on a very large with the East. And this is it gives us a much better understanding of how we should see ourselves as Westerners in relation to the East. And I think it's very important. A lot of Catholics walk around with this sense of guilt about the Crusades, which I don't think is well placed at all. So it's very important, I think, for our understanding of also our self-identity as Catholics and as Westerners, to know what was at stake at that time and what actually happened.
And not only does it show what our understanding of the Crusades influences a lot how we see ourselves as juxtaposed to the East, the Far East, or the Middle East, sorry. But you also can see our understanding of the Crusades shows what we think of ourselves, period. Whenever an empire grows to epic proportions, there's always a certain amount of self-reflection that follows that incredible growth and this rise to power. At least historically speaking, most empires have done that. I think the perfect example of that is the Spanish Empire. And they all of a sudden ruled most of the globe in the space of a generation. And all this, and they were like, well, how did this, what what is going on? And they spent the next 200 years examining themselves in light of this in epic empire that they'd built. So our understanding of ourselves is greatly influenced by how, or let me change that around. Our understanding of ourselves is revealed through how we understand the Crusades in a lot of different ways, is what I would propose. But we can get into that later. Maybe we can tell the folks, what were the Crusades actually?
Well, this is where I think I really do love talking to people about the Crusades, because then I always ask them the question, like, well, what do you think? Like, what is your understanding of the Crusades? And usually I think you'll get either one of two answers. Obviously, one, I think the mainstream answer that most people hold is that the Crusades were a war of Western aggression. You know, the Europeans who were basically barbarian Christians deciding to go and invade the Middle East just to claim it for out of like religious zeal or some kind of misguided sense of religious zeal or idea of like just plundering. So that's an answer that you get, I think, from most people, and that's what most schools kind of, if not directly say, they kind of insinuate that. So that's the general understanding that most people have. Then you have on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have like the hardcore, I guess maybe reactionary kind of Catholic answers that like it was a very holy war that was completely, you know, justified, and it was good in every sense, and it was, you know, just Catholics going to claim the Holy Land. And you're like, yeah, that's the idea, but I think that the truth probably lies a little bit somewhere in between those two, because history is complicated, and that's what people don't realize. Most people want like a simple answer, but you don't really get that with history, because it's played out by like people like us who are complicated and who have many different motives and different currents that are flowing through society at the time. But what they were actually was just a series of wars that occurred between Christians from Europe and the Muslim rulers. There were multiple different rulers in the Levant and the Middle Eastern regions of the world. These crusades, there's not an exact list of how many crusades there were, because there's a lot of disagreement on like, was this a crusade or was this not? Usually historians will look at the Crusades and they'll have like a list of criteria that it has to be in order to be considered a crusade. And normally, at least for the first few Crusades, they were called into being, to action by a Roman Catholic Pope. The first Crusade was in 1099, if I'm correct, occurred in 1099, and it was called into being by Pope Urban II. This was in response to really, this is where it gets crazy, is that we always see as like these Western Europeans as invading onto the rightful land of the Muslims, right? But really, the Muslims had just recently taken over the Holy Land. Historically it had belonged to the Byzantine Christians, and the Byzantines had been in power in that region since the Roman Empire. And so they have a long history of being there, and there's a rich history of Christianity in the Holy Land, because, you know, of course, that's where Christianity started. And so this, the Muslims come into the Holy Land, they take it over, and this shocks the entire Western world. This shocks Christianity everywhere, because this is the holy ground. This is where Jesus lived and walked. And so Pope Urban II calls an emergency council, basically, and he calls all kinds of different bishops and priests and also nobles and knights. And there he makes the surprise announcement that he's calling for a campaign to save the Holy Land. And it's met with a tumultuous response. They're very enthusiastic. And then a few years later, sure enough, the First Crusade happens, and they travel over to the Middle East. So there's a few things that like we can talk about there. But I think the first thing that I want to just kind of clear away is that this was obviously people will say like, this is just a power grab. You know, this is Europeans saying that they don't have an inheritance in the West, so they're going to go to the East and just take land. that's probably true for a lot of them, but I think that can't be the major motivator, because the vast majority of people, of knights and nobles who went on the Crusades, um, returned back to Europe like as soon as the Jerusalem was taken. So like if they wanted to take a lot of land, why did they leave? You know, it was a very small amount that actually ended up staying there.
Right. And I think it's important that we define, or at least answer the more anachronistic look at the Crusades that is so pervasive now. Let's paint this picture a little bit with modern colors, shall we? In that day and age, there was no NATO, there was no UN, there was the Holy Roman, there was the Holy Roman Empire, and there was the collection of Christian states that all saw themselves as a Christendom, of united Christians, not by nationalistic tendencies, not by some collection of rulers that came together and sat in a room and talked to each other, but the fact that they were Christians was an incredibly uniting factor. And in this day and age, we don't understand that, because Christendom is shattered. There's no understanding in the modern mind, really, of Christendom, the idea, the concept of a uniting Christian understanding of the world, which is really, it's sad that we don't have that. But the man of the 1099s, like you were saying, in year 1099, that was something that he would immediately understand. Oh, he's a Christian. He's a Christian. And Byzantium was sort of the bulwark of Christianity on the eastern side. The Byzantium Empire was really the last vestige of the Roman Empire, because Constantine moved his capital to that area when he became the first Christian emperor, and really made it easy to be a Christian. And that was the first time that that was something that you could do and say openly and not be really persecuted for it. So that was seen as a huge threat to, it's, for example, to say in modern terms, it's like China were to invade the UK. And the UK, it's one of our closest allies and is a huge part of NATO. Well, if anyone invades a member of NATO, then all the other members of that alliance are supposed to declare war on that invading country. It's something that we understand. Well, if someone were to invade the Byzantium Empire, all the other Christian countries are going to be very, very, there was no formal alliance saying that this is going to happen, but this is a very, very concerning thing. Because another understanding that we need to point out, Peter, do you remember the Battlestar Galactica, the original one?
Yeah.
I still remember.
Great special effects.
Huh?
Great special effects.
Yeah. Well, for its time, it wasn't bad. I think it came out in the 80s, I think, if I remember correctly. And I remember our Uncle John, God rest his soul, he was telling us about how it's such a different show. It's made from a conservative point of view. And it's so different. And I remember how awed he was by that. And I was a kid. You might not even been born yet when he was talking to me about that. You probably weren't, actually. And he loved the show because it was sci-fi and he was a nerd. He worked for NASA, but he also thought it was so unusual that it was made from a conservative point of view. The conservative point of view is very much like Peterson would say, we have to have walls and borders, and there's danger that's imminent out there. So be careful, be worried about it, because you need to watch out. It's not a fear mentality, but it's a very cautious, like, look, there should be a wall and there should be a border, because otherwise there's death. And what happened in Battlestar Galactica was people were saying, oh, this opposing force is fine. They'll never invade us. It's okay. And then the opposing force destroyed their world. and there's just one battleship left, Battlestar Galactica. And that's the last remaining vestige. And it's because people were not worried about their borders, were not worried about what the opposing forces could do, that this opposing force was able to wipe them out so effectively. And if we look, we realize, okay, there's always this push and pull between conservative and the more liberal idea, where we're not concerned about borders on one side and we are concerned about on the other side. In that day and age, there was something of that. I mean, people don't radically change over the centuries like we think we do. We don't evolve that quickly. There was a real fear that if Byzantium falls and becomes overrun by this whirlwind in the desert, which is what the Muslims were known at the time, then the rest of Christendom will fall as well. We need to be concerned about our borders, because this is dangerous, and we need to understand that level of urgency and fear that a man of 1099 or a nobleman of 1099 or a ruler or a pope of 1099 might have for the rest of his flock, for the rest of his country, for his land. Does that make any sense?
It does. That makes a lot of sense. Like, you have to, I think there's a lot that people miss in their understanding of the Crusades. And I think that is a really big part of it. That feeling of threat, that feeling of that danger at the door. Because Byzantium is like you said, like that would be like their UK, it's their closest ally, who they still look up to, because like people, you don't really realize it, but people did not see they didn't see the Roman Empire ending. It wasn't like there was a year and then the Roman Empire was over. That idea of the Roman Empire transferred over to Byzantium, into the Byzantine Empire. And to people of the time, that is the Roman Empire. And to see the Christian Roman Empire threatened and on the brink of collapse from this outside force is not just a threat, but a catastrophe. This is a danger of catastrophic proportions. This is something that could shatter their entire world. So they feel extremely threatened. It's not that they were like, oh, there's lands over there, we should go take them. You have to realize that this is Christendom. This is a deeply, deeply religious culture, much more religious than our own today. And so we'll get into it in a second. There's a lot that is good about that, and of course there's also a lot that was not so good. But there's also this idea that Jerusalem especially is sacred ground, right, and that
exactly
it needs to be held by Christians, because there was this belief that the second coming would be, Jesus is going to come down and he's going to come to Jerusalem and take up the new Jerusalem into heaven. And so that's the idea here. And so this idea is that we have to hold Jerusalem, we have to hold the sacred Holy Land for the second coming, for God, because this is God's ground, so it needs to be preserved in its holiness, which is interesting because you have that, but on the other end of it, you also have the Muslims, who have also taken quite placed a large amount of value into Jerusalem. It's not their most sacred city, but they also do hold it to be sacred as part of Islam. And so there's that conflict of interest right there as well. I think interestingly, the powers there, the Muslim powers, were pretty secularized. So it wasn't as big of a deal to them at that time. It's not till a little bit later, after the First Crusade and after the Kingdom of Jerusalem has been around for a little while, that there's a religious kind of revival through like the Zengid powers that come in and they have that religious revival, and they kind of realize the importance that they have in Jerusalem. So that's when you get more wars, and then more crusades are called. So it's just, yeah, it's an important thing to realize, just the religious nature of the world at that time and how important Jerusalem is, especially.
Yeah, well, it's the birthplace. It's the birthplace of Christianity. It's where your Savior died and redeemed the world. It's where the Holy Cross was laid, the true cross. You know, this people have forgotten, really. I mean, we speak of it, and there are those others that speak of it as well, that how important Jerusalem is. But by and large, the modern mind doesn't comprehend what Jerusalem means to a man of 1099, because these are realities, these are maps of meaning, as Peterson would say, that have become lost to us. This is to say that Jerusalem, this is just the word, what it means. But it wasn't lost to the 1099 man. It was something important, and something that's crucial as well is that, so they moved hundreds of thousands of men, thousands and thousands of miles, in a time when it was almost impossible to move an army of that size across the country of Poland. You know, I mean, there was the understanding of Poland-Lithuania. So Poland/Lithuania, it was almost impossible to move an army that size just across a little bit of Europe. And yet they moved this massive army. I think the first Crusades, it was like 250,000 men or something like that. And they only counted the nobles.
Yeah. Well, we don't have like an exact number, because they were really bad at counting large forces. Well, and they obviously, like we were saying, they're not inferior. They're just as evolved as we are, but they didn't have super organized armies at the time. There weren't like national armies where there was strict number keeping. So it was a collection of different nobles and different kings who would bring over their forces, and there wasn't like a strict amount. So it's hard to tell, because you get a lot of conflicting numbers in the different accounts, but I think it's very safe to say that it was a very massive force that was very difficult to move.
Right. A very massive force that was very difficult to move, even a small distance, even across one country in Europe. And yet they moved it all the way to Jerusalem. And they take Jerusalem, and then they're like, okay, we don't want to do anymore, because we did the important thing. You know, that's a crucial point, that if they had moved to take some of the surrounding towns that were of critical political / economic importance, they could have shored up the kingdom of Jerusalem so that it lasted way longer than it did. Maybe it wouldn't be around today, but it would not have fallen just a few hundred years later, or a couple hundred years later. And so it's critically important that people understand Jerusalem was important to the rank and file man, that in a way that is not to us today.
Yeah. So you see a little bit of what you were saying, like when they crossed over, the first crusade was, they crossed over by land. Later crusades, a lot of them went by sea through the Mediterranean, which is a lot easier to do. But at that time, they didn't really have the naval support that they needed in order to go by sea. So they had to go by land. And so they're crossing through Eastern Europe through Byzantium, and then from Byzantium through what is now today Turkey, and then down into what is modern Israel. And they were just just plagued by all kinds of problems the entire
logistical problems. Yeah.
You have logistical problems, you have disease, you have people fighting and pestering you the entire way. So tons and tons of these crusaders didn't even make it to the Holy Land. So this is not only do they leave very shortly after the crusade, but there's not even the huge chance of an individual like who's going on a crusade of actually ever even making it to Jerusalem. So this is extremely dangerous journey, and many of them don't make it. And it's funny, it's like there's multiple times that you can, like, you reading primary accounts of times where they hold council meetings, or like they're all deciding like, should we head back? Like, should we just give up? There's many points where they're like, should we give up? And then there's always something that's like, no, we're going to continue going. We're going to keep pushing through. There are some nobles who do stop and who do establish their own kind of claim to power. Like there's the county of Edessa, and there's the a power that's set up around Antioch. Like these regions, they also have religious value as well. But there you do see some of the nobles actually do seemingly kind of more interested in grabbing some power there. But for the large majority of them, it's Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem that we're going to, and this crusade is not finished. I haven't fulfilled my vows until I make it to Jerusalem, because this is a big thing. When you go on crusades at this time, what you do, they didn't see it as a crusade. It was called a pilgrimage. They were pilgrims. That's what they considered themselves, armed pilgrims. But while they're in Europe, the way that they would do it is that they would go to a church, or they would be in front of a priest, and they would say, I take on the cross, and then the priest would wrap them in a pilgrim's cloak. They would be marked with red crosses as this is a sign that you are a pilgrim and that you are now obligated to go to Jerusalem, make your pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and you're not released from that obligation until you make it there. Then you can come back. And then when they take Jerusalem, it's really interesting to like read their accounts, because I think that if you're just reading through it, it seems that a lot of them actually expected like the second coming to happen like then and there. Because like if you think about it, 1099, like it's about to be 1100, and you know how we were with 2000, where it's like, all right, this is it, this is the end of the world. And so this idea, like it was almost disbelief that we finally made it to Jerusalem. And there's this kind of ecstasy, like we've made it to Jerusalem, and we've taken Jerusalem. And now there's almost like this idea that the second coming is just around the corner. And so a lot of them, you don't see any kind of real plans to hold like Jerusalem until like a little while later, because people are like not in that mindset at all. They're not in the mindset of colonization. They're in the mindset of, we have taken the holy city. Now we're here until God comes down. And so it's like just a completely different mindset, which we completely miss in modern accounts of the Crusades. And it's just fascinating to me, like reading through these accounts. And it's like, there's obviously, I think the next question we're going to ask is whether or not we think that these were moral, like if these are moral justified wars. But there is, because, right, of course, I think, I don't know if a lot of people do realize, like know about this, because it's always pointed to as like, okay, so if they're so religious, like what about the massacre of Jerusalem? Because we know that like what ensued right after taking Jerusalem was a pretty large massacre. There's accounts of the main temple, main mosque in Jerusalem being filled with blood, like up to people's like knees, or up, rising really high. Just so much carnage and so much violence that there's just a river of blood. That's impossible. So that is obviously an exaggeration. But we do want to get into that a little bit. But yeah, I think you had a thought right there.
No, I think let's dive into it. There's a lot of thoughts I have, but I think it's important to answer a lot of these objections raised to the crusade. Mm-hmm. That is an important one, the massacre, but also the sack of Constantinople. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that. Go ahead.
Yeah.
What's your answer to that sort of objection?
So there's a lot of things. Massacres after taking a city were extremely common at the time. Like that's just what happened at that time. So it's not, that's obviously that's not a justification for the First Crusade or trying to explain away that violence, because obviously a massacre is wrong no matter what the context is. The if you look at primary accounts, it's really interesting because the Christian accounts really dramatize the massacre of Jerusalem. They overplay it more than is actually possible. Like I was saying, where they talk about blood filling the temple. That's physically not possible. So that has to be an exaggeration. And then when you look at Muslim accounts, they downplay the massacre of Jerusalem. They say, oh, it wasn't actually that big of a deal. It just kind of like this happened, and you don't get it till later that Muslims will actually point to the massacre of Jerusalem and say, this is wrong. This is why we need to retake Jerusalem. So that's the first thing. It's massacres like this after taking a city is pretty common. That's kind of what's expected. And then two, it's not as large as what the Christian accounts portray, because I think that they kind of saw, if you read through it, like I was saying, they're expecting the second coming. So they kind of see this as like blood obviously is a very important kind of symbol to Christians, the blood and like through sacrifice. So I think in kind of probably a little bit of a misguided sense, they see this like as a great sacrifice, like them taking the city and then the violence that ensues after that. So I think that we can really pretty safely say, there's also pretty safely say that this was not what should define the crusade. This is not its defining moment, because there were key leaders like Godfrey de Bouillon, I believe Godfrey de Bouillon, yeah, who refused to take part in the massacre. He's like, I'm not doing this. So you have key leaders who are not participating in this, and you have people and there was actually some nobles who set up zones who they had their own men guard the inhabitants of the city so that the other crusaders wouldn't massacre them. And you didn't have everyone killed. Like there were many people who were also exiled after this. So it's, I think, something that is definitely overplayed. But aside from that, it's not I don't think what you can point to as the defining moment of the crusade. I think you can see it as a lot of them as a reaction, a very reactionary, kind of frustrated response that like we've come all this way and it's been so many years and we've lost so many people, and now this city really resists us, and now we get to have our moment. So there's a lot of different kind of factors playing into that. But I think that you kind of see that more, you should see that more as less as the defining moment of that crusade, because that they didn't they well, for one, yeah, you didn't have the leadership leading and saying like, all right, go kill all these people. It's something that happened that they had to rein in. So obviously I'm not trying to justify that massacre because that's wrong, but I think we have an over dramatized view of it.
Yeah, and it's convenient to our modern sensibilities for us to play into the over dramatization of this massacre. Why is it convenient? Because it's not convenient to think of people that are so on fire for Christendom, for Christianity, and for Jerusalem, and for the protection of Christendom itself, for the survival of their faith and their way of life. It's not so convenient for those people, to exist, and then for them to actually be right and good. Mm-hmm. And so if we want to discredit a larger movement, a larger organization, and a larger way of just living the Christian life, then it's very convenient for us to really play into the missteps the wrongs that these people have done.
Mhm.
And it's also a very modern thing that we've seen in recent era of, if you do one thing wrong, or that is less than perfect, maybe it's not even wrong, but maybe it's not polite, for you to be completely banished, for you to be excoriated everywhere, no longer fired from your work, for you to no longer have a place in polite society. And if you apply that to the Crusades, that same, well, you have to be in all times perfect, well then yeah, the Crusades are going to fall short of that. Absolutely. It's a group of violent men that were wild and crazy enough to march hundreds and thousands of miles into deadly territory where they're probably going to die, like you said. And if you're wild and violent enough to do something like that, and I don't use the word violent in a pejorative sense, I use it in a sense that describes who you are. And you can take a violent nature and use it for incredible good. There's history is full of examples of violent people that are very good people. But you also are going to be prone to having mistakes, terrible, awful, completely horrible mistakes, like massacring people after you take a city, like massacring your enemy after you take a city. You fall short of the Christian ideal which calls you to love your enemy. And so you fall short of it. And every Christian condemns the action of a Christian that falls short of the ideal. But we're not called to condemn the Christian itself, to condemn the person who makes that evil action. We're called to condemn the action itself. And so I think that we see a lot of reasons now for us to play into the over dramatization. And I'm another thought that occurs to me is Chesterton's Ball and the Cross. The Ball and the Cross, where the main character gets tempted by the devil, and he gets taken up into his airship, and he sees a vision of the future, a perfect utopia. And in this vision of a perfect utopia, there's these people that are walking up, I think, to a church or to a state government building or something like that, in very orderly lines, and an old woman falls down, and a guard grabs her and like beats her a little bit because she fell and she is not moving as fast as he can. And the main character points this out to his guide, who is the devil in disguise. And the devil says, well, she should learn to go faster. And that's the point where the man who's being tempted by the devil realizes this is the devil, and says, and names him for who he is. Because you shouldn't say that an evil action is good. And this is the point that the main character makes. You can, however, say that a good movement has people in it that do things poorly, that do bad things from time to time. That doesn't make the movement or the government wrong or evil or bad. It just means that there's fallen people that make it up. So I think that's the distinction we make, is the action itself is wrong, and realizing that doesn't make the whole movement of the Crusades wrong.
Right. Yeah. That's huge. Like you're saying, like we have that mentality today, that if you do like one wrong thing and you're canceled, you're out. And this is obviously a very huge wrong thing, a massacre. But this is not their defining moment. I don't think we can say that. And then you also mentioned like the sack of Constantinople. People might point to that and say, like, obviously these people are just out to for their own gain and for their own glory. And that's in reference to the Fourth Crusade. So this is a couple of hundred years later, where they sacked Constantinople. And unfortunately, like in retrospect, obviously you can always see things better in retrospect. In retrospect, that crusade was doomed from the start. You could definitely see, if you had a bird's eye view of the crusade unfolding, that one was never going to work.
Why?
Well, because they, at that point, they were very decided that they have to travel by sea. Like, sea is the way to go. And who were the Christian navies at the time? It was the city-states, the Italian city-states. And so they go to the city-state of Venice, and the person in charge, the Doge, he's called the Doge of Venice. He is a very Machiavellian kind of like leader. He's obviously not out for Christianity. He's not out for the glory or the good of Christianity. He's out for his own glory and his own good. And so he agrees to transport the Crusaders, but only with certain conditions. And one of them is that they have to stop in Constantinople, and they have to make certain demands to the emperor of the Byzantine emperor, because at this time you have Byzantines somewhat decline, and you have Venice. This is Venice's heyday. They are a naval, a sea empire, and so they're actually competitors with the Byzantine Empire. And so he kind of coerces the Crusaders to make certain demands for him in order for them to be transported to the Holy Land. Lots of things go wrong along the way, and they are the crusading force is pretty much co-opted by Venice as a Venice army, a Venetian army, and the Byzantines know this. They're very leery of them, and so they actually do a lot of kind of things to hurt the crusading force. And so this comes to a really unfortunate conclusion when, in response, the Crusaders then just descend on the city and take everything for themselves. And you can kind of see, it's really interesting. You see a lot of Byzantine statues and Byzantine art in Venice today because of the sack of Constantinople, because they stole a lot of the things that were there. And these are, you know that these are not Crusaders who are stealing it, because you see the things in Venice now.
Yeah.
And so like these are Venetians out for their own gain. And there were large amounts of the Crusaders who, when they saw this unfolding, were just like, no, I'm not going to be a part of this. And a lot of them went back home, and a lot of them kind of watched
disbelief, really.
Watched in disbelief, like saying like, what is happening? So that one is much easier to understand than the massacre of Jerusalem, because it's literally like there. And then there were the Pope, even after this, condemned the sack of Constantinople, saying like, this is not worthy of a crusade. This is basically, this crusade is not a crusade now, because like this is, you didn't even go to Jerusalem.
Yeah, and there's this incredible like literary movement afterwards, where there's all these characters coming back from this failed crusade in shame, and just they go to they'll go to Rome to beg for mercy. They'll go to these different church areas just asking for mercy because they're ashamed. And it leads me to the point that really excites me as a storyteller, because it's unmined territory. All these, you've mentioned Godfrey, you've mentioned the leader of the Venetian Navy. I forget the name you said. What was the name?
The Doge of Venice.
The Doge of Venice. A great name for a villain right there. There's villains and there's heroes, and it's varied and it's rich, and no one hero is completely always heroic, and no one villain is always completely a villain. just like true life. And so if you love Game of Thrones, if you loved that whole intrigue and the fantasy that's developed from it, well, here's good news for storytellers and people that want to watch great stories, is that we have way better than Game of Thrones to mine, to present, to say, to speak about. And the drama that unplays on an epic scale during these crusades, the heartbreak and the true sadness, like it's a tragedy. And the many parts of this story are incredibly glorious, but most parts are not. Most parts are incredibly tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And this is story that we can mine. This is story that we can learn from because of how rich and human it is.
Mm-hmm. I think that you could, like, really, if you had a really big budget, you could make a really, really good TV show about the Crusades. Like, it would make Game of Thrones look like a piker, because there is, just like you're saying, there is intrigue on a like massive scale. You have extremely motivated individuals on both sides, and you have like in just a lot of tragedy. There's so much ground for storytelling. You're really right about that.
Yeah. And I think, at least I'm not speaking of running down Game of Thrones. I've seen not all of the episodes, but enough to get a feel of what it is. And it's incredibly epic when it's done in its high points. It's incredibly boring on its low points and lewd on its other points. But when it's at its best, it's epic. And we can do way better than that. If you're right, you would need a ginormous budget. I would not want to try and make this story right now, because you need to establish who you're making the story for. And that's what we're trying to do right now, is establish who we're making stories for. And while you're doing that, you're making smaller ones, smaller stories. But yeah, this is something, if not us, some Catholic filmmaker needs to be working to do.
It's really interesting to me too. Also, like going along this this point, is that the most interesting story to tell in regards to the Crusades is the truth. You know, like it's most interesting to not tell a story with an agenda. We're not, like, I don't want to tell a story with as Christian propaganda, and I don't want to tell a story from modernist propaganda. Like, both of those would be boring, or at least less interesting. But telling the truth, like the actual what we do know of the Crusades, is the most interesting route. And I think that's really interesting, like as a storyteller, like to like, oh wow, like when like telling the truth about history is actually more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, in every way. Well, let's bring it back, because we're running out of time. Why is it important? What can we take away from here, the Crusades?
Well, I think as Christians, obviously this is our heritage, but I think that there is a lot that we can learn from the Crusaders. And I think that there is an important aspect of our faith that we kind of downplay today, that is important for us to actually realize and to be aware of. Like, I think we've spoken about it on the podcast in the past before, but we are considered the church militant. That's the people, the Christians on earth living right now are considered the church militant. And that's an interesting choice of words that the church has used, because militant, of course, makes you think of military and of having a mission. And so we do have a mission. The way that the Christians of that time understood this mission was to go and to take like this earthly, what was considered the most holy place on earth. And so that translated in their minds to a very, very physical, very kind of earthly understanding, but nonetheless a deeply religious and deeply Christian view and desire. So I think that we can really take a latch onto that, whether or not, like, in retrospect, we consider the Crusades to be moral or immoral. Because honestly, I think that that is such a complicated question that you can't just say, yes, the Crusades were moral and right, or no, the Crusades were immoral. Because, like we were saying, it's very complicated and there's many different factors going into it. So sometimes they were really good and sometimes they were really bad. Um, so it's hard. You can't just say like blanket yes or no. But aside from that, that motivation, that consuming, like, these people put their lives, probably, like, they could basically assume on permanent hold. They left family, they left inheritance, they left everything. And many of them sold everything that they had just so that they could go onto this really dangerous journey. So I think that you kind of see very much like the calling, like a good response of the calling that Jesus has in the Bible. Like, you take up your cross. Like, literally, they're asking, they go to a church and they ask for the cross to be put onto their shoulder as pilgrims. They're taking up the cross and they're going, they're following their understanding of what Christ is calling them to do. And so I think that we can, as Christians, really look to that as an example of fervor that we should have as Christians for our faith and for taking up our cross and responding. Because they, like I was saying, they sold everything, they left family, and Christ calls us to do that in the Bible. He says, like, whoever loves, your father and mother or your children more than I is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. And so this is a great example that we can look to. I'm not saying, to clarify, that we should all grab our swords and go be violent in the Middle East. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that we can, if we were to apply that same crusader zeal to our faith today, we would have a very much better off world.
Yeah, the Middle East is not the enemy. We are the enemy, our own darker sides of ourselves. There's no black and white person. There's people that are fighting their darker sides more than others. And what we can take away from the Crusades, at least what I'm taking away from the Crusades, is we are dangerous. We can be incredible forces in our world. Just look at what these little crusaders went off and did on a grand and epic scale. I mean, most of the people were not nobles that were marching, and yet these little people went out and did amazing things that had never been dreamt of being able to accomplish before. Marching an army that far and taking that much territory back at the call of the Pope and the Byzantium Empire, the emperor, it's incredible. And we can do that. And in our own backyards, we have, if we are foolish enough to dream bigger and brighter and better, and to live to our Christian ideal. Mm-hmm. And as far as we are able to keep that ideal, we will be successful and we will be doing what is good. The Christian ideal has never found to be wanting. It's just us that fail at following that ideal are found to be wanting. Mm-hmm. And yet, so long as we're victorious, so long as we strive, we will be victorious. Mm-hmm. So whatever monster our listeners happen to be facing right now, know that we are just as monstrous. We have just as much ability to face and overcome that monster as whatever this impossible thing that seems to be facing us now is facing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's my takeaway, is that we are monsters just waiting to be awakened in a good way.
Yeah, we have that ability within us that we can. Yeah, we oftentimes see ourselves as weak and ineffectual, but we actually can be very effectual. And that's the thing, that Christianity and our faith belongs in the public square. Like it's our faith should be personal to us, but we are not called to hide it in our churches. It belongs in your workplace, and it belongs in the government sphere. Like everything, all these places is where you should be taking your faith. And that's what the Crusaders did. They take their faith out into the world. And I think that's a huge thing that we can really take away from that.
Yeah, it's not truly personal unless it's public as well. Because if we keep it out of the public, then we are part of the public. Who is the public if not us? So if we keep our personal beliefs out of the public, then they're not really our beliefs because we are the public. So it's a complete inversion of logic to say anything else. But we're running out of time. So Pete, thanks for suggesting the Crusades.
Yes, thank you. Really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you also found this conversation interesting. And until next time, I guess we'll go ahead and sign out. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.